Welcome to the second episode of Opposite Tracks. I am happy to be joined today by Michael Greer and Mohammed Al Hakim. Michael, how are you doing today?
Hey, Trek Nation, I'm doing great. Excited to have another episode under our belt.
Lovely. And Mohammed Al Hakim, thank you so much for joining us. How are you, man?
I'm very good. Hello there to all the opposite trackers. Let's make this so.
That's great. Are you guys ready?
We're ready.
Absolutely.
Here we go. Welcome to the second episode of Opposite Tracks. I'm your host, Menhal Yunus. I'm joined today by Michael Greer and Mohammed Al Hakim, and we'll be discussing the Tuvix problem. I want to thank you guys again for being here. Just sort of as a preamble into how this episode goes. Mo, what interested you in the Tuvix episode in the first place? If you could remind us.
For me, it was through teaching. I would use it as an instrument in teaching ethics. And the episode has always been great because whether you're a Star Trek fan or not, it's a standalone episode that kind of invokes a central ethical question that I think anybody can pick up and use it to tease their intuitions about what is ethically right, ethically wrong.
That's awesome. Michael, did you have an interest in this episode as well?
Yeah, I loved. I think this is a really powerful episode. First off, Voyager is always my favorite. I have to figure out how to fit that in every episode of every
That's
show.
okay. That's okay.
But I think it's a really powerful moment and a powerful time for Janeway, and it really shows the weight that sits on every captain in Starfleet. And so I really am excited about the episode.
That's great. I'm really happy about that. So, of course, you guys all know where I sit in terms of the ethical good and the moral good in terms of the Star Trek universe. I find that the Federation, although can be problematic, it is not emblematic of anything that's insidious or anything that I would say goes beyond the moral good. And when they do, they have their come to, Jesus moment where they explain that this isn't, that we've gone too far or whatever. They at least recognize that nature and try to fix it in the long run. Now, I will ask Mo. I'll give you a very quick. I'll throw to Michael. I'm sorry. I'll throw to Michael for a very quick synopsis of this episode. That's okay. And to let sort of the viewer know which episode we're talking about, who is Tuvix, how did this happen, and why this episode was important. Michael.
Yeah, definitely. So I appreciate that as a Voyager fan. What happened, as you all know, Voyager is stranded in the Delta Quadrant, and they are constantly on the hunt for resources. And so on one of these opportunities that they are trying to find and locate resources, it is an away team of Tuvok and Neelix. And they beam down to a foreign planet, and while searching for resources that they can bring back, things to cook, things to help grow in the aeroponics bay, they uncover a new flower. This flower is very interesting, and it resembles an orchid. And as we all know, orchids are Tuvok's favorite. We know he is a prized orchid grower. And so they decide to bring it back. In transporting it back to Voyager, there is something that happens within the actual transport buffer. The 3 DNAs and 3 patterns of the flower, Tuvok, and Neelix all merge into one and create Tuvix, who, as we see, makes great fashion statements. And so, Immediately, of course, we notify security and he is transported to sick bay. We do a quick evaluation and realize that he is a combination of all of these characters. We then start the process of integrating him into the crew because on our initial discovery, we can't separate him. He is one, and so he begins to work his way through. Work his way from the kitchen all the way up to the bridge, and ultimately through the discovery of science and utilizing some radio tagging from the early 1900s, they are actually able to identify a way to separate Tuvix. From there, Janeway is forced to make that really tough decision. Forced to make that really tough decision of actually separating Tuvix into Tuvok and Neelix over their over the apprehension and requests of a couple of members of the crew. So it's a really interesting episode. That's after they've been separated. It's a really interesting episode, and it's really powerful in that you have two very central and main characters of Star Trek Voyager who aren't able to speak for themselves, and Captain Janeway is forced to do that on their behalf.
Wow, that was really good, man. Thank you so much for that. That's great. It's giving us all the main salient points about that. Mo, is there anything that you would like to discuss? One question I think that you entangled with your own students was at the end of this episode when you showed it to your class. You would ask them a specific question. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the class, the question that they had to answer was, did they agree with Captain Janeway's decision uh, to terminate or kill off Tuvix, whatever term you want to use, I know it matters, of course, to bring back these two other characters. Because the Doctor couldn't do it for reasons that are tied to his programming and the ethical codes of his practice. And, you know, and it was a question that would force the students, and I think forces anyone to really think about what are my ethical intuitions about this, right? Regardless of what I think of Janeway's decision, where do I sit on this kind of moral dilemma? And that always made for a really good conversation. So that's the question. That's the question I still pose, right? Do you agree with Captain Janeway's decision? Why or why not? What reasons can you give to support your position?
Would you like to respond, Michael? What do you think?
Well, I would allow the professor to actually go first on this, and I'll be the rebuttal this time.
Well, typically I wouldn't give my opinion if it was in the classroom because it shouldn't matter what the professor thinks. It matters what the students are able to apply their reasoning to. I'll say this, I think more of a general standpoint. At the end of it, the ethical decision is always going to be tragic because it's always going to involve some immeasurable cost that cannot be simply reduced to a quantitative measure or a simple yes or no. However, I think there are things to be said about Janeway's ethics and how that might conflict with her overall duties and responsibilities as a captain. And in circumstances in which we don't want any captain to base his or her or their ethical decisions based on sentiments. Because for reasons we can get into a little bit later, if morality is based strictly on sentiments, it can be problematic for understanding how we can apply it universally, given that we all don't share the same sentiments. And so there's something scary about her decision at the end, that she's willing to let her own sentimental view determine what ought to be the case, rather than appeal to some kind of rational principle or something that could be more objective in her decision making. So that's one way to look at it. But of course, there's many ways to look at that outcome and its motivation.
Interesting, Michael.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's very interesting. I would say, I think that in the episode we don't necessarily see only sentiment being the primary driver here. What we see is the ability of a crew to adapt and a captain to adapt to a changing situation. And so we see that Janeway immediately said, hey, there is a concern here for security. Let me give him something to do, give him a role. Let's see if you can cook. He utilizes his ability. We show that beautiful image of her actually saying, hey, I am embracing you. I am trusting you. I am eating the food that you are cooking. I am in the mess hall. I'm getting to know you. I'm creating that safe, that warm, that connection. And yes, that is sentiment. Having that connection and establishing that connection is sentiment. When we ultimately, that's a very sentimental picture. Look at that. It's a beautiful image. It's beautiful imagery there, and I think that this scene is very well done. But that is sentimental. I think that when we are forced to have Janeway on the bridge and when she's making the final decision of sitting behind her desk and actually thinking through the ramifications of losing two crew members, for one crew member, but also having the responsibility to the broader crew and the impact to the broader crew. I don't think that that's sentiment. I think that there's a rationalization in that. And also remembering that we entered the Delta Quadrant with a smaller crew and a smaller component driving the ship and driving its operations than we actually planned for and that we actually needed because of the way the caretaker pulled us in. And so I think that when Janeway is sitting behind that desk and she's forced to make that trek out onto the bridge and really deliver a verdict in that sense, that's not an easy thing. And I think that all of those rationalizations are also weighing on her, and all of those ideas matter to her. In coming to her decision about actually separating Tuvok and Neelix. So I think that there is sentiment. I just don't think it's where you're placing it. I think there's sentiment in the allowing of him to join the crew and connect with him. I think it is a very rational decision that she made in making the decision to separate them.
Mo.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that her decision is not just strictly sentimental. It's obviously driven by some rationality. In this case, that it might be pragmatic reasons, like two crewmen is better than one, like you were saying earlier, right? The spaceship can't afford to lose too many crewmen or crew personnel. It might be grounded in her duties as a captain. But my worry is twofold. First is we're kind of thrusted into this world, coincidentally or intentionally. It doesn't matter what normative beliefs you have to the origin of our existence. And ethics is partly about determining how to cohabit, not to determine who gets to exist with us. And Janeway, Tuvix is born out of a pure coincidence, right? Tuvix is not a byproduct of some nefarious act or some intentional act to destroy two lives in order to bring one about. He's thrusted into this universe for no fault of his own, comes to develop a sense of identity. And that gives him kind of a right to exist that the captain seems to come to play a role of determining who should coexist rather than how we should cohabit the world together. And my fear of the sentiment, if I can just maybe clarify my position a little bit more, it's the fear that if you base your morality, if we're trying to develop a moral system that's supposed to be impartial and universally applicable, right? I don't want your morals to become my morals. I want morals that I can subscribe to, even if I don't share your particularities, right? That's kind of what we're trying to get in ethics, some kind of shared universal moral doctrine that can inform all of us, regardless of space, time, cultural background, ethical background, political background, and so on. When Janeway bases her decision on a sentiment, namely that she also loves Tuvok and loves Tuvix, and that her love for them plays a role in informing what she thinks. Sorry, with Neelix, that becomes scary for me, because if on scenario number 2 the exact same incident happens, but this time with two crew personnel who she doesn't like very much, and they come to form this third person who really is kind of more. Tuvix is kind of also set up as the best of both worlds, right? He's logical but not very stiff. She even comments, Janeway, I think at one point, that she enjoys his company in a way that she doesn't enjoy it with. And he's like Neelix in that he has his talent, but not kind of annoying, or at least
right
the way he's portrayed. But if on day number 2, Janeway simply doesn't care for these two characters, then, and if her sentiments is driving her reasoning, then in some sense, the better decision on occasion number two, which might be fine, but as a person that's trying to find a universal ethical rule for guiding my behavior, it's come down to pure sentiment, which makes it ethics partial, makes it grounded in particularities that deprive it of its ability to be normative. That is to say, to tell us what we ought to do
Mm.
rather than just. That's where I'm coming at it with the sentiment. I think her decision is tragic no matter what because she's going to lose a life, whether it's the life of the two or the life of the one. But the nice thing about ethics is that it doesn't come down to simply utilitarianism. Right? It's not that two is always better than one, even though I know Spock uh,
Needs of
endorses
the
that.
many.
The needs of the many, right? I mean, it's a fundamental, not to bring religion into this too much, but it's a fundamental Christian ethics. The sacrifice of the one for the needs of the many is fundamental to holding a particular ethical Christian type of view of life, and that comes to inform, a lot of I think Star Trek's background, especially Spock's ethical approach. Um, but anyways, that's what I mean by the sentiment. I think it's a difficult decision, and the captain has to make it because nobody else can make it. And she says, "I'll take responsibility for it." Right? She takes
Excellent.
ownership, and that's certainly something that's commendable at the end. That she's willing to stand responsible for her action, which in this case means. Now we can use the words: Does she kill one, or does she let one die? Is there a moral difference between killing and letting die? Uh, is the loss of two lives for one always necessarily worse than the loss of one for the two? Um, and they're not easy, and there is no right answer. But the question is supposed to illuminate the space for us to have what we're doing right now, you and I, right?
Yeah.
Engaging, right? Because at the end of this, oh, I feel like I've lost him for a moment, and so I win the argument. Just kidding. You were gone for a second. I was.
Yeah, my
It
Wi-Fi
flipped out.
my Wi-Fi knows it will not let me lose an argument. Manny, I definitely want you to hop in here. But
Yes,
I just want to go back to one thing.
please do.
Um,
I have a
I'm
point. Go on.
when you were talking, what popped into my head was the intro to Next Generation, to seek out new life. And in that seeking out of new life, what is our limit? What is our barrier? What is the stopping point? Um, and as we're looking for kind of that moral limit or that moral boundary in our seeking out of new life, we we will not allow, as a federation, me speaking as a member of the federation in a distant future, we would not allow for a individual to decimate an entire culture or an entire civilization in order to formulate a new life. We would not allow for the crystalline entity to
I was going to
continue
go to the Crystal Institute.
to harvest planets and all of these living organisms to sustain its life. We were going to intervene. We were going to stop it. And to that point, I think, yes, it is tragic. But in looking for that moral framework or that moral guide, I think that we would see that Janeway's actions are consistent with the overall moral guide that we see from the Federation. One, but two, uh, the examples you give aren't necessarily uh, don't necessarily align. The examples you give don't necessarily align with that overarching moral guide that has been established as we look across Janeway's decisions, not just in this point, but also otherwise. But I do get when you look at it in its singularity of itself. Yes, um, yes, I can see that concern and that question popping up. But I think when you're looking at it in a totality, I keep wanting to say totalitarian. You put it on my mind. But when you look at it in a total sense in an overarching character development, I think that Janeway's morality is established, and it aligns with the overall moral compass and the moral arc that is created in the actions of Starfleet overall. But we'll come back.
Yeah.
Let's give Manny a second to get in here, though.
No, it's okay. I'm super in. Like I'm listening to you guys making these arguments, and And what I'm reminded of during this, and let me just punch over here, is an episode of Enterprise. I'm gonna throw up a picture real quick if I can find it. Um, and it has a similar. I just thought about this as we were discussing it, and I just quickly
The
looked it up.
evolution episode where the species.
It's
Yes.
not, but yes, I was gonna.
Oh,
This is the symbiont episode, but yes, there's the evolution episode as
yeah.
well. So in this episode, they have to grow a new Trip, who's the engineer, because he accidentally like gets hit, he's dying, and they need him for the mission. They are off. They're far away from Starfleet, and they have to grow this life, just so they can grow this small part of its brain. This kid here in this picture, and they're gonna kill the kid and harvest him for the whatever. And you see the captain looking over, and he's like he had to make a moral decision and say, "I need my engineer to complete this mission. It's for all of Earth." And yes, Phlox makes the argument. He raises the kid. He's trying to be good for the kid and whatever. But he still takes at the end of the day, he makes a command decision and he says, "You have to. We have to complete this mission. We can argue later about what is the moral good and what is the moral bad in this situation." And so I would compare it also to this picture of of Voyager. You can see here Janeway looking over at Tuvix's shoulder, where she eventually has to come to the ideation, even though Kes has made the argument, even though Tuvix says that he loves T'Pel and Kes. T'Pel is Tuvok's wife equally. They're not. It's not an equal argument to a captain of a ship who's far flung away and needs her security officer, who needs her Tuvok. Um, it's a decision that is based in the military necessity of the moment and less so of what we would call the greater moral good. And although it was within the framework of what you would call the larger part of what Starfleet would have done in that situation, I'm sure Mo is chomping at the bit to say something here. I would say that militarily, as a commander, uh, Janeway did the right thing. I think that there should be some Deus ex machina of like being able to replicate. Like you have this flower and it can split these two people, right? You also like replicate them or clone them? Can't you find some way to still find and grow a Tuvix? But I get it. For the mechanic of the show, let's not entertain the possibility of
Well, it wouldn't be a
being
dilemma anymore, right?
Right.
right.
I mean, if you can get out of the dilemma, that's always the best answer, right? If you could have all
Yes.
three characters survive at the end, perhaps that may have been a morally preferable set of outcomes than the one that Janeway.
In
has
a way,
to.
it's like the trolley problem, right? Like it's
Yeah, of
like
course,
that.
it's exactly what it is. Just but put into a larger context, obviously. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So no, that's okay. So this is my comparison: is in this episode of Enterprise. Michael, do you know what I'm talking about? This episode,
Mm-hmm.
they have to go and they have to fight this Indie, and they have no idea what they're going into. They're far flung away, very similar to Voyager. Something happens to their chief engineer, like the human component of their ship. They can't do the mission without him. And so what I would say is that Tuvok was just as essential, Neelix, but Tuvok was just as essential to the mission. Oh no, it's happened again. It's all right. All right. Michael can't stand it. Michael, he has to get out of the kitchen. It's too hot. Anyway, so that's the point I'm trying to make. Is this? I noticed the similarity of like killing a life to save a life to preserve it for the mission, and in both cases, the captain had to make. They had to say, "This is an order. Uh, I'll give you this in writing. You can do whatever you like, but this is happening." At the same time, like when Cisco gave the biomimetic gel to do in the pale moonlight, he's like, and Bashir says, "I think I'd like this order in writing." He's like, "I thought you would," and he hands him a pad, and he's like, I protest." He's like, "Protest all you like. Have it ready in an hour." And that is the sort of decision that I think that is being made here. I'll give Mo the floor. Go ahead, Mo.
No, I agree with that. We have the luxury of time to sit around and think about what the captain should do and what would be the right thing, what would be the wrong thing, what debates took place. But in a moment's action, right, whether you're a general or a captain or somebody or a police officer, there's a moment in which you have to make that decision, and she'll make it for better or worse. But still, again, I mean, generally, this utilitarian argument, um, this utilitarian argument that we need this person to carry out this mission is for the greater good. I mean, part of the problem with utilitarianism in general, and this is kind of a major critique by people like John Rawls, is it doesn't take the difference between people seriously, right? We're just reduced to an instrument, 1 out of 100, and the elimination of the one would be more beneficial to the 100. obviously in today's constitutional democracies, we put limits on what we can do to people, right? So we can enslave 10% of the population for the betterment of 90% of it, right? I think we have good arguments against that. But again, if you're going to base your ethical decisions on basically what would be most instrumentally valuable given the moment, it's always going to have this pushback of, well, how do we know on the long run that's the right decision, and why should we be okay with the termination of one life for the benefit of the many others? And I get it. You might say, well, that's the reality of it. But I still kind of refuse to believe that we have to reduce ourselves to this kind of ethical dichotomy of one versus five. That the tragedy rests in precisely the way that we think about it, and that we might want to challenge the entire framework that we take towards in the ways we think about who deserves, rather than, for example, thinking about who deserves to live on the world with us. It's a matter of thinking about how do we coexist, because we're all thrust into this universe together, Tuvix alike. But it can be very dangerous if one group gets to decide who gets to cohabit the world, right? Or what principles ought to be the ones that dominate.
So I want to take a second and step a little bit away from the military aspect as well as the kind of utilitarian aspect. And so my thought goes to the scene of Kes going to Captain Janeway. In it, she immediately wants to plead for the life of Tuvix, but she's like, I love Neelix. I care about Neelix. That it's pure sentiment. And I'm immediately thinking to my time in working at an emergency room, where the question is, what do we want to do with this individual? We can put this individual, we can send them up to upstairs, we can put them on life support, or we can make that decision now to go ahead and remove our medical interventions and allow the natural course of life to take effect. And I think that Kes had, in her own way, had that conversation with Janeway, and that what is the responsibility that Janeway has to Kes as his next of kin in making that decision to say, I want my person that I have responsibility for as the next of kin, I want them to continue to live.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Where does that fall in that kind of analysis in our thought process, or in yours, Mo? Yeah.
I mean, the dilemma for the captain is a conflict between her duty versus her personal sentiments or personal feelings on the matter, and this broader perspective of what will be better for the entire crew, not just because a captain could have conscientious objection, right? She could object to her duties as a captain if she thinks they conflict with some other value that she cares for. I think what Kes does in that scene is that she adds to the balance of reason for the captain by appealing to pure kind of genuine emotional concerns about what will be the case if Tuvix is allowed to live and the other characters die. And the captain, I mean, look, I want to be a rationalist about it and say the captain should add Kes's reasons to the balance of her reasons, like nobody else, like no differently than anybody else. Is just to be added to another vote in the system. But I think it has more sway on her, and she comes out of that room kind of fired up and ready to make this decision. And again, you can see it in her face after she makes a decision and she leaves the room. There's the last shot of the episode, if I recall, is Captain Janeway's face, and she's like, there's that sigh of no matter what, there's going to be an ethical conflict here.
Yeah,
right.
I just worry that it influences, that her judgment is influenced more by her sentiments rather than what would rationality have called by. Now, to go back to an earlier point you said that I just want to throw in here is, you might say, well, but Captain Janeway, through the arc of the show and in relation to the Federation set of ethical rules, she's actually acting very consistent. But to me, that just pushes the problem one level up, right? Because now I'm just going to ask the same questions about the ethical code that the Federation subscribes to, right? Where does that come from? Who's writing that up? Why is that the right code versus another set of codes? So it just pushes the argument up to a relativist position, that she is acting morally good in respect to what would be considered morally good by her Federation standards. But to me, there again, just another cultural group in a universe full of too many cultural groups. And why should the Federation's moral arc be any more real or any more important than any other group's moral arc, even if it radically differs from our own? And I think part of me is I'm unable to take Federation sentiments and universalize them to the entire galaxy. Right? I think we eventually meet up a group that they don't agree with our sentiment. They're excluded. They're the other. They're the irrational. They're the backwards. They're the immoral. They're the ones that don't necessarily deserve to coexist in this universe because they bring something that we devalue. Right? And that's where I think I get to push back is that, yes, she's acting in a certain way, but these ethical codes are themselves the manifestation of a particular cultural group, which in Star Trek happens to be predominantly white. And male. And I joke around with Manny. I always say the first female captain they show us, and the first Native American commander. And what do? They throw them out in the middle of. We get lost. That's what they do with it. We get lost. We joke around. We say, that's what they do with it. They get lost.
Minorities.
They're not even part of the Star Trek universe in some sense. They're all the way together.
So far away.
Good luck getting back. But of course, statistically, we have a woman captain and we have a Native American. They're just lost. They check the boxes. The Federation checks the boxes. But that's the ethical tension, right? And I value it because the Federation is always expanding. Manny and I were talking about the inclusiveness of the Federation. But to me, inclusiveness here could also be a euphemism for conquering. It's kind of a way we're all inclusive. Well, you can't be all inclusive. Something has to be excluded from your Federation in order for you to be a group. There is no group without the other.
I just hear, I can see you and Michael Eddington sitting in a Maquis cave, chilling out like, they are more insidious than the Borg.
Yeah, the Borg are honest about their mandate. Why do the Borg scare Star Trek? They scare us because they take away our autonomy, our ability to self-rule. So why don't you find a way to make people part of the collective without feeling like they lost their autonomy?
But to that
Federation.
point, wait, whoa, so I disagree.
I know, yeah, for sure.
There are prime example. There are a number of species that we have learned to interact with and cohabitate with. We, as the Federation, again, have learned to interact and cohabitate with that have decided not to be members. The Shellyak, for example, they are not our friends. Yeah, they are not our friends by any means, shape, form, or fashion. However, we acknowledge they have a right to their own moral and ethical code, and to which we even allowed them to, we would have allowed them to sterilize, as they called it, a planet and kill our own people who are acting and utilizing their own autonomy. We tried to intervene. We did the best that we could. But we allowed both the autonomy of the Shellyak to exist and the agency of the Shellyak to exist, and we allowed the agency of our own individual citizens to exist. And we would stand back. And taking this back to the Tuvix problem, I think if Janeway would have been in the place of Picard, she would have made the same decision and allowed the agency of these two individuals to exist. Ethically, I think that it's unethical for a captain to allow a life to be taken, quote, needlessly, just for their own unwillingness to make a decision that or make their own unwillingness to move. But morally, and I think I'm getting these right, but the professor will correct me in a minute. But morally, I think that the decision that Janeway would make in that instance is morally correct, because it actually speaks to the ability of each of them to utilize their own judgment and respecting their own autonomy in their decision making. Hopefully I use ethically and morally right. I haven't had to use those words in a while.
Well, if you're working with lawyers, no, you don't. I mean, there's a lot there, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Um, in terms of respecting the autonomy, right? So lots in that language, right? So first, the way you were describing it as, well, I can think of a scenario where we came across a certain species that could do X, and we allowed them to do X, right? We tolerated it, if I can use that word tolerance. And in a few moments, I'm going to tell you why I also, like most people, think tolerance is a terrible word. Um, so they tolerate it, right? We could have interfered with their autonomy, but we chose not to. We find what they do to be devaluable, but we're going to allow them to do it out of respect for their so-called free choice. That language is full of tolerance for me, right? And tolerance implies two things. It implies, first of all, that we have the power to intervene but choose not to. So it already puts us in the morally right side of the conversation, right? We are being the nice people by not. But also, when you tolerate something, you also take a necessary moral judgment of it, namely that it's
Mm.
not valuable, that it's weird, that it's backwards, that it's wrong, but I'm going to allow it, right? So one can think about, in our own society, going back the last 50 years, language of tolerating, LGBT members, or language of tolerating African Americans. Very problematic when you put it. We've moved away from that language towards recognition, that we recognize the value of others and that their value might differ radically from our own, but it doesn't make them any more or less important. Um, so I can respect that whole autonomy speech and respecting the autonomy of certain groups and not wanting to interfere with them, but it doesn't get the Federation away from still having its own ethical conception that it does think is the right one and tries to impose, right? That's the tension is always going to be there, no matter how much you expand your principles.
Tries to impose with the acceptance of others.
Sure, it can appeal. It can appeal to those values as like it needs to be, agreed upon by others. And certainly they can be in a position of negotiating circumstances where they have the upper hand, where it looks like a choice and it's not. Um, and that's fine. I can agree with a system where you require others to use the carrot approach rather than the stick approach. But to me, it's still a way in which the Federation uses its powers to expand its conception of the good life on the universe.
Let
Humans
me
might,
let,
sorry, go
let me
ahead.
interrupt. No, it's okay. I'm just gonna sort of wrap us up here. I do
Yeah,
have.
this is
I want
great.
to. I hope you're enjoying it. Listen, I just want to crystallize because I've been listening to what you guys are saying. In the episode, Janeway herself makes the argument, after all this consideration, that Tuvok and Neelix are not there to defend themselves. They just aren't. They're not there, and that despite all of these arguments about autonomy and what should or should not be done, two things I'll keep in mind. A, she makes this argument that they're not there to defend themselves. B, even though we're privileged to see to the end of the episode, we don't know that this process will actually reverse Tuvix. He could die and they'll have lost all three lives in this scenario. So what I will put to you both, and I want your last words on this, and I want you to put A, knowing that Janeway was there in defense of Tuvok and Neelix and not Tuvix, what are your thoughts on what she did? And B, not knowing whether or not the process would have worked, did she still do the right thing? I'll throw to Michael first and give Mo the final word.
Not knowing that the process would work, I would say, I think in the episode it was presented more like definitively it would work, but like let's play in that. Let's play in that for a minute. I think to subject a new life form to an unknown experimental treatment would definitely violate our ethics and violate the ethics of the morals and ethics of the Federation. And so I would say, in not knowing that the treatment would be successful, in subjecting Tuvix to that would be 100% wrong. And Janeway would, in my opinion, once we read that log and taking responsibility, would be subject to some sort of action, especially if it happened in an adverse manner. And I do have to agree with you to a little, not just being the contrarian that I am naturally, to some extent on showing up and saying that I am a representative of Neelix and Tuvok. I think that's wrong. I think that she should have, if anything, allowed. Again, time wasn't of the essence here.
Right.
She
It was
should have really allowed the presentation of the arguments to her and really attempted to look at it from a more dispassionate viewpoint. And I go back to um, the data episode. I forget the name of it. Think measure, not Measure of a Man, but where Riker and Picard are forced to argue against each other in front of an advocate general.
Measure of a Man.
It was Measure of a Man.
Oh yeah, that's
Look at
classic.
me, look at me, and I didn't even have coffee. Um, but I go back to that, and something of that nature probably would have been more appropriate. But I think ultimately we still would have ended in the same place. But I do agree
Exactly.
with the premise that you gave. She would have been wrong, and I see a lot of fault in her not removing herself from the decision process, or being not removing herself from the argument process, and not just being the ultimate arbiter of the decision.
Mo.
Yeah, and I would say that, sticking to what I initially said about her decision ultimately being tragic, um, I think that Tuvix was a fully conscious, self-aware being who had a conception of an I, who conceived of himself as a living person who has all the same fundamental rights as the rest of us do. And we get into problematic thinking when we begin to weigh numbers versus each other, two versus one. So I do ultimately think that Tuvix did nothing to be punished in the way that he was at the end of the episode. And so, to go back to that fundamental legal principle, it's better to let 100 guilty people go away than to punish one innocent person. And he has his life ended, terminated, executed, fully aware, fully conscious of the execution being taking place after pleading his case and making an argument why he has a right to exist. And the fundamental natural right that we all do is, trace it from Hobbes, Locke, wherever we want. We have a natural right to exist, self-defense, and that means we can kick and scream on our way out, and we have a right to do that, to do all things to avoid the worst of all things, which is supposed to be death, the cessation of all passions. So I think he was just an innocent individual that was thrust into a universe and had a right to exist. And so, to me, individual rights should always trump utilitarian considerations. And so I leave it on that kind of classic Rawlsian standpoint. But I think the decision at the end should have valued his individual freedom, autonomy, even if it comes at the cost of the loss of two lives, which were equally tragic that they're lost. But so I think she made the wrong decision, but a difficult decision nonetheless.
Okay.
That's
Thank
it.
you so much, guys. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being here. I really appreciate the feedback and the support. I'm really happy. I would love to continue these as a series where we pick fundamental ethical and moral problems. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Mo, so thanks so much for being here. I'm gonna give you both the last word and let you tell me what your thoughts are in terms of the overall arching conversation that we just had. I'm gonna give Michael a chance. Go ahead, Michael.
I think it's great. And I look forward to reading the comments and seeing where the people, everyone who reads this, the whole Trek Nation that reads this, or what reads this, watches this, and reading what they have to say and where they land. And I'm in a number of different groups on the Book of the Faces as well as on Twitter, and so and I know that people are going to. This is probably going to end up in one of those threads, so I'm looking forward to it.
I really like that. Mo?
Yeah,
Mo, man.
thanks for inviting me. This is my first time doing this, and I enjoyed the back and forth. I think the whole point of arguing, something we've lost today, is we forget that the point of arguing is to shed light on shared topics of interest, not to generate heat.
Uh-huh.
And so it was nice to have a conversation where we're exchanging ideas about something that matters, right? Because this ultimately isn't about Tuvix. It's grounded in our debates about euthanasia, about abortions, about political freedoms, about cultural rights, religious rights. And so it's nice to be able to dive into something that doesn't get people as heated, even though I know that some Star Trek fans can absolutely get overly heated over this. But And the same thing with sports. It gives us a way to take a slice out of an issue and examine it more thoroughly and put it back in without kind of causing the type of divisiveness I think that our political discourse causes today. So I welcome more of these conversations because they do actually do more good than I think some of the more serious conversations that take place in the public forum.
See, what you now have to do is you now have to watch all of Trek and pull it back to some specific social issues going on anywhere in the world, and we're gonna have to pull those threads. You just created more work for yourself.
I was gonna say to you earlier, this whole strategy of not interfering with the autonomy of a group and respecting them was similar to the Napoleon strategy to conquering Egypt, right? He decided not to interfere with them, but just to set up and watch them and build a library to study the Arabs as a way of conquering them. So I do think the Federation has other ways of conquering groups without being so explicit in its agenda. But that's for maybe next conversation.
Definitely, for another time.
For sure. Thank you.
And no problem. Thank you so much, boys. I'll see you next time. Take care.
I just want to talk to her. No, I just want to talk to her. Like I heard, like what I think Robin said. I think she wanted to pull her hands back.
She wanted to do a bitch.
No, she wanted to.
Bitch.
So if you can't tell, they have thoughts about Discovery.
Look, here's the thing. Cancel culture might get everyone else, but they won't come for me in this subject. If you are our allies, we are not talking to you. We are not talking to you. This does not pop. Okay? We're not talking to you. Stop trying to take our shit and make it your goddamn business. It ain't got nothing to do with you. It ain't got nothing to do with you. Did I say that? No. I said Atlas and Cardassian. If you are neither in that category, go to another show.